Conversará junto con el presidente del Centro Argentino de Ingenieros, el ingeniero Pablo Berecertúa, entre otros temas, cómo podemos reinventar las organizaciones en el siglo XXI. La inteligencia colectiva es una herramienta novedosa para las organizaciones. ¿Qué podemos aprender de ella para la nueva normalidad? Como siempre, este evento está transmitido en simultáneo por el canal de YouTube del CAI, donde podrán volver a encontrar esta charla como todas las que se desarrollan en el CAI. Compartiré con ustedes una síntesis de la bio del profesor Malone para luego dar inicio a la conversación. Thomas Malone es director y fundador del Centro de Inteligencia Colectiva y profesor en la cátedra Patrick McGovern de la Gestión del Colegio Sloan de Administración, ambos del MIT. Asimismo, es profesor de Tecnología de la Información y profesor de Liderazgo y Diseño Organizacional. También fue fundador y director del Centro de Ciencia de Coordinación del MIT y de la iniciativa Reinventar las organizaciones del siglo XXI, de la misma casa de estudios norteamericana. Durante las últimas décadas, Malone ha anticipado, mediante su investigación constante, sobre las principales tendencias no solo en el mundo de los negocios, sino también en la tecnología. Por ejemplo, en 1987 predijo sobre los negocios de la electrónica, introduciendo un concepto que hoy en día se llama gamificación, que es la técnica de aprendizaje que traslada todo el potencial de los juegos electrónicos al ámbito educativo para mejorar los resultados. En 1997 acuñó el término economía de la lanza electrónica, que anticipó la economía gig por 2 décadas. En 2004 publicó su aclamado libro El futuro del trabajo y en 2018 publicó Superminds, donde revisa en él la inteligencia colectiva desde perspectivas muy diversas. El profesor Malone también ha publicado más de 100 artículos de investigación y capítulos de libros. Es inventor con 11 patentes y es coeditor en 4 libros. Ha sido concejal de 3 compañías de software, consultor, asesor y miembro de juntas directivas de varias organizaciones. Su trayectoria incluye un paso como científico investigador en el Centro de Investigación de Xerox en Palo Alto, un doctorado en la Universidad de Stanford, un doctorado honoris causa de la Universidad de Zúrich y otros títulos de grados en matemática aplicada, ingeniería y psicología. Con esta bio, agradecemos nuevamente que haya aceptado su mención como socio honorario y le cedo la palabra al presidente del CAI, el ingeniero Pablo Berecertúa, para que comience con este evento. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Verónica. Muy buenos días a todos y especialmente al profesor Thomas Malone. Como hacemos normalmente en estos casos, vamos a cambiar ahora al idioma inglés para avanzar primero con el acto de nombramiento de Thomas como socio honorario de nuestra institución, del CAI, y luego, y muy interesante, vamos a tener una conversación con él, voy a tener una conversación con él, donde seguramente vamos a ver cómo piensa, cuáles son las ideas que tiene sobre temas que son fascinantes y muy relevantes actualmente y con un enorme componente tecnológico, donde la tecnología y la ingeniería juegan un rol central. So, good morning everybody. It is for me a real pleasure to be making the opening to this event that we are holding at our institution, the Argentinian Engineering Center. As everybody knows, this is the main institution for engineering in our country. It is 126 years old, and our institution has a very unique degree that is Honorary Fellow, and that degree is typically awarded to some personalities that for several reasons we think are an example and also a way of thinking in different fashions on what it is that is happening and what may be possibilities in the future for all of us. So, as we do typically in these events, in this initial part of the event, I will be doing this, awarding this designation to the Professor Thomas Malone, and we will be talking together after that. So let me begin by saying, hello, Tom. It is a real pleasure for me to be holding this event with you.
It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me now go to this formal part of our event and share with you and with all of us our bylaws. And in our bylaws, there is a formal part of our text that reads that honorary fellows are going to be awarded to people in science, engineering, and in any other activity that become public figures and that have themselves made a significant contribution in their country or worldwide in order to develop knowledge and also to foster activities and projects that may be highly beneficial for humanity, for their country, or for the profession. This designation, and this is very important, is a lifelong designation without any charge. And also it is very important that it has not been as a consequence of a promotion of the awardee. What happens is that our main board, by unanimity, identifies some people that we believe are examples in their fields and that we would like to name them honorary fellows, and then we send a letter, a formal letter, and this is what happened in this case. And we, at this point, are able to say that we're very happy that Professor Tom Malone has accepted our denomination. So it is for us also not only a symbol to our society, but also a way of including you in the network of the Argentinian Engineering Center for, of course, enriching our views and also, if it happens, to collaborate in some of our endeavors. So once again, Tom, it is for me, in my character as a president of our institution, really, I want to say, a truly honor to be naming you honorary fellow. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to receive this honor, and I'm very, very appreciative. Thank you very much.
Okay, so after this initial part, which is what we call the formal designation, we move into a conversation really with you, an informal exchange of ideas, and there are so many topics that come to mind in order to talk to you. But let me start with a very broad question. So, how do you see, and what is your take on the reality around artificial intelligence? Are we really in a moment where things are being disrupted and they will be unimaginably different from what they are right now? So the question is to try to synthesize that, to make it minimalist. Is artificial intelligence a real game changer for all of us or not?
So that's a very interesting question. And what I think I want to do is take a middle ground in answering the question. I think it is absolutely a mistake to say that artificial intelligence will have no impact and not much use. But I think it's also a mistake to say that artificial intelligence will take over the world and the world will be completely different and we won't recognize anything. I think the truth is in between, as is often the case in questions like this. I think that artificial intelligence has, in the last few years, the last decade or so, made tremendous strides and is now able to do things that would have been completely impossible, say, 10 years ago. And I think many of the things that AI is now capable of doing will be extremely useful in many parts of business and other parts of society. On the other hand, some people think that AI in the next 5 or 10 years will be as smart as humans and will take away all the human jobs, and then eventually they'll assume there's no reason to have humans, and so they'll kill all the humans and take over the world. I think that's very, very unlikely. And I think the fears of that are quite misplaced. I think it's also wrong to assume that AI won't help much. I think part of the problem is that many people seem to think of intelligence as one-dimensional. You know, a human is smarter than a dog, and a dog is smarter than a cockroach. And if computers get to be as smart as dogs, then they're almost as smart as humans, and pretty soon they'll be even smarter. I think that is a mistaken way of thinking about the situation. I think intelligence is actually a many-dimensional thing. And there are certain kinds of intelligence for which computers have been for 50 years better than people, like doing arithmetic. It's been many decades that computers have been better than humans at doing arithmetic quickly and accurately. And I think there'll be more and more things like that that computers will do, not just as well as, but in many cases better than humans. Certain kinds of pattern recognition now, computers can do better than people. Seeing patterns in vast amounts of big data is something that computers can already do at scales that humans can't begin to think of doing. But there are also many, many things that people still do far better than computers. Even something as simple as carrying on a conversation. Any 5-year-old human is able to carry on a sensible conversation about a much wider range of topics than even the most advanced computer programs today. And many kinds of common sense and understanding of human relationships and many other things, computers aren't anywhere close to having the capabilities that people do in those areas. So what I think this means is that contrary to the way people often see this as a choice between people and computers, and just a matter of time until the computers are better than the people at everything, I think by far a better way of thinking about this is to say that the real opportunity here is not computers taking over from people, but computers working with people to do things that could never be done before. So that's my short answer to your question.
It's very interesting what you have said. And let me ask you if you believe, because I'd like to, so to say, cross your definitions with 3 dimensions, which are the economy, the politics, and institutions. So let's start with the economy. So from my understanding, we have very preliminary theories about the economy. So the way even the best economists, and this is probably because this is a human process, and it's also a very complex one and a changing one, but the way we think about the economy it may be old-fashioned. So in a sense, we, for example, assume the principle of not having enough of anything. So economy has a long tradition of not including abundance. So my first question to you is, do you see this middle ground, but a very positive middle ground that you are presenting to us, as important, so that we will have to reshape the way we think about the economy, or not?
So I think this will require some changes in the way we often think about things. I wouldn't argue that economics is fundamentally flawed and we need to rethink everything. I think economics, I don't consider myself an economist, but I think I know enough about economics to say that the things that we're talking about with the internet and so forth and artificial intelligence, I don't think those change the fundamental principles of economics. But I do think many people have a limited view of economics and therefore make some, what I would believe are incorrect assumptions about what will happen. You were talking about the scarcity society, or the assumption of scarcity. I think that's one place where many people often make a mistaken assumption. In particular, many people seem to assume that there's only a fixed amount of work to be done. And if computers do some of the things that people used to do, that means there'll be less work for humans. But even in very standard economics, that's certainly not guaranteed to be true. Let me give you an example to illustrate that. Let's push our minds back several centuries and think of the time when scribes copied books by hand. There were many people employed as scribes to spend their days copying books. Now, that's a very expensive way to copy things, and so it could only be done for a few very valuable books like the Bible in the Middle Ages. But now imagine what happened when the printing press was invented and became widespread. I suppose there are probably still a few scribes in places who do it because it's cool, but for the most part, the profession of scribes has been completely eliminated by the technology of the printing press. So that meant definitely scribes were put out of work. But think about what happened as a result of the printing press. The printing press made it far, far easier and far faster and far cheaper to copy printed material. It no longer needed to be done by hand painstakingly by these human scribes. It could now be done almost instantly, very, very cheaply by machines. So what did that mean? It meant that it now became economically feasible to copy vastly more amounts of printed material than could ever have been done economically when the copying had to be done by hand. So the printing press made it possible to have what we now think of as the publishing industry. It made it possible to have not only a few important books, but it made it possible to have vast numbers of copies of novels and magazines and newspapers and science fiction stories and comic books. And that meant there were vast numbers of new jobs, not only for the writers of these books, but for editors and illustrators and typesetters and newspaper delivery boys and newsstand operators and on and on and on. Vast numbers of new jobs were created, even though a relatively small number of jobs for scribes were eliminated. So that's something that happened several centuries ago, but I think it's a good analogy for what's likely to happen in more and more parts of our economy. Yes, computers will do some of the things that used to be done by people, and those people will no longer be doing those things. They may be doing other things in the same industry that they couldn't do, they didn't have time to do, it wasn't economical for them to do, or they may be doing other things in whole new industries that are created because they're now technically and economically feasible. So I think
now, yeah, but if you go back to the definition of the economic system, the economy, let's say, of a country, of a city, all those changes, which I assume are happening faster now than they used to happen, let's say, when you compare to those times, we certainly are facing many innovations happening at the same time right now. So the consequences of that is that it may be, I don't know, how do you stand in front of the idea of, for example, what the people of Singularity University are promoting, which is the notion of abundance, and the idea that what we will see in the next decades is that energy will not be an issue, so energy will be abundant, it will be very cheap or way cheaper than it is today. And if you go on with that reasoning, then the whole system will be different, because several of the things that are now constraining the way we live are going to be released. Would you agree on that?
I agree with the way you just said it. I think that some things that used to be big constraints will no longer be. The constraint of the difficulty of copying things is now greatly relaxed, and it's now possible for vast numbers of people all over the world. Many, many millions of people can see everything we put up on the internet. And the recording of our conversation today will be available, though not necessarily seen, by millions of people all over the world. So that's a big reduction or relaxation of constraint. There's a kind of very strong form of that argument, which you were talking about, the singularity and the economy of abundance. I wouldn't rule out the possibility of some kind of singularity where someday computers become so smart that they kind of have some exponential increase and the world is just completely different. I wouldn't rule out that possibility in principle, but I'm much less confident that it will happen anytime soon than some people are. I think that one thing that you see when you look at the world is that exponential growth occurs in many kinds of situations. It can occur in the spread of predators in a population of prey, and it can occur in a lot of different situations. But in the real world, every single example of exponential growth that has ever happened before eventually reaches some constraint. And so instead of seeing an exponential curve that goes to infinity, we see what starts out looking like an exponential curve, but becomes more of an S curve. And as it gets closer and closer to some limit, it begins to slow down and eventually stop its increase, unless the limit is increased again, in which case you may see some other levels of S curves one after another. So I think that's what we're likely to see. Constraints will be reduced or for some purposes eliminated. We'll see exponential growth in those areas until we reach some kind of limit. So, energy, if you could say that energy has been extremely abundant in the last few centuries. So abundant that we've used forms of energy that generate carbon emissions and that then cause very undesirable changes in our climate. So that's an example where when you're talking about carbon-based fuel as the source of energy, what was a very weak limit is now becoming a stronger and stronger limit all the time. And it's becoming apparent to many people that we can't continue to use carbon-based energy at the way we have without some major changes. Maybe we'll find other forms of energy where we won't have a limit for a while, at least not a very binding limit. But I think there's a kind of extreme version of the abundance argument that says we'll have everything in abundance and so there will be no problems and the economy won't work because everybody can have everything. I find that pretty implausible, because when one thing becomes free, other things that used to be not important because you never needed to use them suddenly become important, and they become the constraint rather than the other thing. So I think that's a more realistic view of what's likely to happen.
Now, let me take you to this hypothetical case that you are meeting a president of a country. So I know you don't know details about Argentina, but let's say it is Argentina. So you have a meeting and this person will be really much willing to listening to you. And the question is, what do I have to do different in order to be, so to say, be able to develop in this new world that you are telling me about? So what do you think are things that politicians and traditional institutions, nation-state institutions, need to be rethinking right now according to this new reality that is coming up?
So that's a really interesting question. I think I'll take the question to mean, what can countries do with respect to the viability of their population, their citizens in this changing economy? In some cases that will be helping to advance the very state-of-the-art of our understanding of artificial intelligence or nuclear energy or whatever it turns out to be. In probably all cases, a very important part of the question will involve how can we increase the chances that our population is still economically viable in this new economy. And I think for everyone also, it will include questions about how can we create a world that we'd like to leave to our children and our children's children. So let me try to answer those two questions separately to some degree. In the case of the first question, how can our population remain productively employed or economically viable to the degree they want to do that? The kind of obvious and almost cliched answer is, well, we need to be sure that our population is skilled in the new technologies. So obviously a very important new technology is everything related to information technology, communication, the internet, artificial intelligence, all of those things. So it would certainly be important for the president of this country, let's say Argentina, to do what seemed possible to increase the quality of education or educational opportunities for people in the country to become skilled at using the technology, at developing the technology. So software developers and AI experts and so forth. That's kind of the obvious cliche answer. It's certainly correct, but by no means comprehensive in my view. Because another way of thinking about this is to say, just as we were talking about with the publishing industry example a few minutes ago, is to say, as this technology becomes more capable, more widely used, more economical, what other things are likely to change in the economy? In the case of the publishing industry, the usefulness of good writing ability becomes greater when there's a technology that distributes well-written material freely. So what are some of the things that the new technologies of the internet and artificial intelligence will make more economically useful? I think we still don't know the answer to all of those, to that question, a complete answer. But here's an answer that I think would be surprising to many people, and yet I think is likely to be important, including for, let's say, the president of Argentina. In a kind of paradoxically surprising way, I think that new communication technologies, and for that matter, new artificial intelligence technologies, are actually going to increase the importance of knowing how to get along well with other people. In other words, the benefit of being good at personal interactions, having interpersonal skills, that benefit is in some ways increased when communication technology makes it so easy for so many people to interact with each other. It's not just a few people in a small town who've known each other for 30 years who have to somehow get along with their crazy neighbors. It's that now there's lots and lots of opportunities for lots and lots of people all over the world to have all kinds of online communication and writing, kind of by video, et cetera. And you need people to facilitate all those things. You need people who are good at all those things. So I think you need interpersonal skills and also common sense about dealing with the world and with other humans that requires essentially no technical knowledge. You know, a little bit of knowledge about how to use the software or the technology that's necessary here. But a lot of what you need is something very different. And so I think for some countries and some people, the real opportunity for them will not be to become an AI programmer. It will be to become an online community moderator or an online salesperson who's good at convincing people to buy things online, or various other things, online therapist or an online personal trainer. I think there's lots and lots of opportunities like that that aren't quite obvious to people, but I think will turn out to be very important. So if I were advising the president of Argentina, I'd suggest he or she think about some counterintuitive possibilities where they might be able to have a strategic advantage because other countries hadn't quite seen yet the potential importance of that. So that's kind of the answer to the economic part of the question. The other part of the question is not just how can we make as much money as possible in the next 10 or 20 years, but how can we create a world that not only would we want to live in, but that we would feel that we had fulfilled our responsibility in leaving that world to our children and our children's children. These are in some sense harder questions. They're not simple questions of economics or technology. They're essentially questions of philosophy or even spirituality, if, or whatever is the source of your values. And I'll give you some answers that are in some sense shaped by my philosophy in that regard. Not everyone would necessarily agree with them. I think one that's pretty obvious and that more and more people are now realizing is we should try, I think, to avoid ruining the environment, the climate, and many other aspects of the environment on our planet before our grandchildren have a chance to use it. So that's certainly something I would say to the president of Argentina. I think in some sense, the even more important thing has to do not with the meteorological climate, but with the social climate. That is, what kind of society, what kind of world, what kinds of feelings would we like to have common in a world for grandchildren? And I think there, some aspects of economic thinking can even lead us astray. If we're all out to make as much money as we can for ourselves and to do the best thing in the short term, but not even thinking about the long term, that creates a kind of dog-eat-dog cutthroat environment, a cutthroat community, perhaps. I'm not sure that's the kind of world we want to leave to our descendants. You know, some people would find the answers here in religion or other kind of spiritual pursuits. Others might find it in understanding the world and the universe in a deeper scientific way. There are many ways people can understand what's really important in life. But I think if I were counseling the president of Argentina, I would suggest trying to catalyze conversations in the country about what kind of country do we really want to be? And how can we take advantage of the new technologies to make that more possible in ways that were never even possible before? So that's a fairly deep philosophical direction. I don't know if you intended me to go that deeply, but hopefully that will spark some thoughts for you and others.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you get that into very concrete issues, it becomes very significant. So what do you promote? What are the regulations? How do you allocate the resources that you have as a public sector? So if you want, let me go back to more to the US example, but as a mirror to some of these thoughts. And some of us are noticing that in this new world of a lot of innovation technology, there are very significant private sector companies that are leading somehow. At least they have become very powerful, very strong. I'm talking about the companies that you may be thinking about, Google, and all of those, even Tesla and SpaceX, and what you see is that there is, I don't know, this is a question for you, by the way, but some people are concerned about the idea that this is a very unequal world where you have really a concentration of capacities in very few players, not only wealth, but also knowledge, and also the possibility of impacting in the agenda and in the world. So at the same time, probably together and coupled with that, you have a real increase of well-being on average in the world, which is also happening. And also, some people say, well, this is only a phase of this story, because in the future, what will happen is that there will be several of them. Now we are in an initial phase of this new sort of economy, highly driven by the innovation and particularly technological innovations. But there are so many startups and so many ideas, and everybody is now in the possibility of playing the game, that there will be a different scenario in the future. So my question to you is, what can you share with us about that? First of all, are you concerned with the way the capitalism has evolved in a sense of very powerful few players? And also, do you see that as a given, or do you see that there will be changes in the future?
Okay, so let me start with that. Even mainstream economists would say that there are times when monopoly powers, either as sellers or buyers, monopsony or monopoly, when monopoly powers of a single or a small number of players can have bad effects and are bad for capitalism. So there's nothing unusual about that. That's part of standard economic theory, and most economists would say that a good thing to do is to use the powers of government to restrict monopoly behavior, either to make it impossible, or in some cases like utility companies to manage the behavior of the monopolists that are there for some good reason. We can't get rid of them, but we need to be sure they don't abuse their situation, their power. I think most people would agree with that. There certainly can be questions about how to do that, what kind of restrictions, when is it appropriate, and so forth. But I think most people, some regulations of monopolies is useful. And I think there's an increasing sense that that may be the case in some of the big tech companies. I think it's interesting to observe that one reason why this probably occurred in the high-tech industry is because that information technology is often subject to a kind of winner-take-all economy. That is, if you're creating a software program, it's very expensive to create it, but once it's created, very cheap to make copies. And so the first person or the first company that gets a very good web search algorithm coded can then copy it very, very cheaply, almost free. And it's harder and harder for anyone else to compete with them. That's different from physical products where, it's difficult to make copies of something physical, even after you've figured out how to design it. In software, that's not so true. And so and information in general, that's not so true. So it's probably not a surprise that we saw the emergence of these very powerful players in the high-tech industry. The question in that case is, what should we do about it? What kind of regulation is appropriate, or other kinds of actions by government is appropriate? I'm not an expert on this area, and I don't want to give any sort of specific recommendations about exactly what should be done, and what companies are the biggest offenders and all that. But what I want to do instead is make a bigger, in a certain sense, more philosophical, but it's not really philosophy. It's almost an organizational design point about the different kinds of players in a society. This is a point I made in my book, Superminds, about 5 different types of superminds. The first and most obvious one is hierarchies. So companies, almost all companies we know are essentially hierarchies, and governments, the kind of executive part of a government at least, is also a hierarchy. But hierarchies aren't the only way of organizing things. There are also democracies where decisions are made by voting instead of by the boss telling you what to do or delegating a decision to you. Democracies are very important in governments and also in some companies and other kinds of, especially nonprofit organizations. Another very important kind of supermind is markets. Markets are a way of making group decisions, not because a boss tells everyone what to do, or even because everybody votes about what to do. In a market, the group decisions are made as essentially the combination of a whole lot of pairwise agreements between individual buyers and sellers. So that's another, in some cases, very good way of making a group decision. A fourth and very important kind of supermind, different from all of those first three, is what we would often call a community. So by a community, I mean a group where group decisions are made by a kind of informal consensus based on shared norms and reputations. So community isn't always just a local geographical community. The Engineering Society of Argentina would be an example of, I guess, a hierarchical organization that tries to catalyze a community and probably uses some democracy in some of the decision making. So in fact, that combination itself illustrates a very important point here, which is most situations in the real world involve the interactions between several different kinds of these superminds. In most cases, there's some kind of hierarchical something and some market stuff involved and maybe some voting about things like a democracy, and also very often some kind of community norms that have a big effect on what happens. So I think in general, back to your original question of what should we do about high-tech companies that are too powerful, in general, I think a good way of thinking about that question is to think about how can we combine and balance all four of these different kinds of superminds. What are the best ways to use hierarchies? So a big company like Google has a hierarchy, but it's also part of a government or a society where there are laws passed by democratically elected legislators, enforced by a hierarchical regulatory agency or kind of police force or whatever. How much should we rely on government to regulate these powerful companies, hierarchical companies? How much should we rely on communities to do that regulation? It's possible for a community to have a lot of influence without any governmental power. If I can digress for just a moment to illustrate that point, regardless of what you think about it, I think whether you agree with it, I think you have to agree that the Me Too movement has had a powerful influence on some very big hierarchical companies and their leaders without any kind of governmental intervention, no laws, court cases, or anything like that. It was just the community saying, this is a violation of our community norms. And enough people agreed with that, that it had a big effect. So there may be ways that communities can help regulate these powerful companies, as well as democratically elected governments. And also markets can have some effect. You know, it's conceivable that some new technology will be invented that will decrease the power of the powerful IT companies of today. And then they may fade in power without any governmental regulation. So I'm trying not to take a specific position on what should be done right now today politically, but to instead kind of make this an example of a much bigger question about how should we configure combinations of different kinds of superminds in our society to achieve good outcomes. Oh, I think you're muted.
Yes, I am. Now here I'm back. So and thank you, and that is very interesting. And you have done a lot of work, and your books, Superminds, is in a way, let's say, a summary of several of the ways you can think about collective endeavors and collective intelligence. So my question to you is, really a new phenomenon is the sharing economy and all the business models that are right now happening and maybe in the future disrupting some other industries. So what is your take on that? Where are we in that process? Are we at the beginning and there will be way more sharing economy and we will be ending up disrupting industries and processes that we thought that it was impossible to really reshape them into the sharing economy, or not? Or this is already done, and let's say Uber and Airbnb and all the examples we already know, this is it. So my question to you is, do you see more sharing economy in the future or not?
Well, first, let's kind of define a little bit more what we mean by sharing economy. From the two examples you gave and my sense of how people usually use the term, I'd say one way of defining it would be to say it's a case where a service that used to be provided by very big hierarchical companies employing many people to deliver that service will instead be provided by communities of smaller providers, often an individual person or contractor, coordinated by a market-making organization, or maybe even a platform that makes a much more efficient market. Does that seem a reasonable definition to you?
Yes, I agree.
Okay, so I think we have not seen the end of that. I think there's still quite a bit of opportunity for that. That's something that I've been writing and talking about for close to 30 years now. I wrote a paper in 1987 called Electronic Markets and Electronic Hierarchies, where I was essentially saying, as technology reduces the costs of markets, the coordination costs of finding who to buy from or who to sell to, and evaluating and figuring out how good those things are, as those costs become lower, then it will become economically desirable to let markets make more decisions that previously would have been made inside a big company like General Motors or IBM, inside a big hierarchical company. You can either, to pick the example of cars, you can coordinate the production of cars by having General Motors own not only the factories, but the steel foundries and the rubber plantations, and to some degree, General Motors in particular did do things like that in its early days especially. Now, car manufacturing is more coordinated by markets, though there's still hierarchical companies doing it. And things that used to be done by big taxi companies or big hotel chains are now much more often being done by Uber and Lyft and Airbnb. So I think that's not a coincidence. It's not an accident that that's happening when these new technologies make it so much cheaper and easier to do that. And I don't think we've seen the end of that. I think there are lots of things that could be done by individual contractors instead of big companies. Let's take software development as one example. I was on the advisory board for a company called Elance. In fact, my colleague and I coined that term, Elance. Elance since merged with another company and is now part of a company called Upwork that provides an online market for lots of contractors to do software development, other kinds of engineering, but also things like writing fiction, things like that. So I think we're likely to see more and more examples of that. That's people might not call that the sharing economy because you're not sharing physical objects like cars or houses, but you're sharing people's skills in a much more hierarchical, much more kind of market-oriented way, which I think is certainly consistent with the notion of a sharing economy. And I don't think we've begun to exhaust the possibilities for that.
That's very interesting. What do you think about blockchain and the idea that this may be a collective way of redefining the monetary systems?
Well, certainly, I think that's possible. Blockchain is best known now as the basis for cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Again, I'm not a deep expert in this, but it sure seems likely to me that many of the things we do with paper money are already obsolete. I hardly ever use paper money, and I stopped carrying coins many years ago. But that still relies on a kind of government-issued currency enforced by central regulatory bodies in national governments. It seems to me, well, it's clearly possible, and it seems to me likely that it will become much more common for some of the things that used to be done with what I guess is called fiat currency to be done more and more with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. So I don't know how fast or how far that will go, but it seems to me very likely it will have a big effect over the coming few decades. Another more radical possibility enabled by blockchain technology is things like what they're calling distributed autonomous organizations and various kinds of things where you can create software that will automatically make certain decisions. So in other words, instead of having a contract that people sign and that is enforced by a legal system with judges and police officers and so forth, you can have what are essentially contracts, but they're actually just software programs that have encoded in them unambiguous rules about what to do if person X has not submitted their payment by time Y. And no judges are needed. It just, that's what happens because the program does it. So I think we're not as far along in understanding how to take advantage of those capabilities as we are with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. But I think in the long run, those may be even more important capabilities for changing our economy.
I have two more broad fields to ask you about, and one of them is the pandemic. So I really would like to know what you think is going on, what is changing with this pandemic. Some people are talking about a new normal, that people will now use a lot more technology, as we are doing, by the way, right now, in all fields, and that will impact even the economic geography of the countries, because people will decide to live away from their downtown areas where they used to work. So my question to you is, with this approach you have and you know about, which is the collective intelligence, do you see now big changes happening because of the pandemic?
So a number of people have said this now, but very early on in the pandemic, I also said that I think the pandemic has been like a bullet train to the future. In other words, many things that would have happened anyway, like much more remote work and things like that, I would have thought they might have, changes that I would have thought might have taken 10 years happened in 2 months in the spring of 2020. So I think the pandemic has greatly accelerated a transition that was made possible by technology. I mean, the Zoom technology that we're using today didn't exist 10 years ago. There were earlier versions of it, but it was only just in the last 3 years or so that we got technology that was good enough that we could have used it for remote work of the sort that all of a sudden became very common last year. So we were just barely there, and in the normal course of things, I think it would have taken many years, maybe a decade, for people to gradually realize, oh yeah, I guess we could maybe do this remotely. And yeah, these 2 people want to work remotely, I guess we'll let them. And wow, what if a whole group of 10 people wants to work remotely? Well, maybe we'll do a little pilot test and see how it works. All of that happened in a few weeks in March and April of last year, and it worked pretty well. I mean, not perfectly, but I think many people were surprised at how well it worked. And so I think that's now made it clear that there are huge opportunities here. In my view, there are some organizations that are saying, well, we can hardly wait to get back to being in person in the office. So let's call our people back as soon as we can. And they were ready to do it this fall. And now people are hanging back with the new Delta variant, et cetera. You know, certainly there's some people in some organizations where definitely it's good to be in the office part of the time, or maybe even all of the time in some cases. But I think the future is really going to be much more location independent work. I'll give you one other specific thing about that, by the way, which is that many people say we have to come back to the office, not because we can't have meetings online. We now see that we can do that, but we need to have the informal interactions that can only happen in person, face to face, the things that happen in the hallway outside the meeting or around the coffee machine, the ad hoc conversations. I think they're absolutely right about the importance of those conversations. They are, however, I think, absolutely wrong in the long run about the idea that you have to be present in person to have them. My colleagues and I created a demonstration system to illustrate this, a pilot system, software system we called Mingler, which tried to support, and I think illustrated that you can support the kinds of informal interaction that occur in the hallway outside a meeting or around the coffee machine, where you just see who's there and you decide who you want to talk to. And if they want to talk to you, you can have a private conversation instead of the big everybody hears everything meetings that we have in Zoom. And then you might talk to them for a couple minutes and then go find somebody else you want to talk to and talk to them in another private little video conference. So that's not the only tool to do this. There are a number of other tools, including there's some ways of using Zoom that give you a little bit of this, and there's some other software tools that do it. I think it's surprising to me that not more people have realized that it is already possible, and will get better and better and easier to support these things online, which will eliminate one of the other main reasons people want to go back to the office. So I certainly think there's a future for face-to-face in-person conversation and meetings, but I think it'll be much less ubiquitous, much less required than many people even today are thinking.
What can you share with us about education? So you are definitely a great educator. So my question to you is, first of all, and even under the lenses of technology and new technologies, my first question to you is, what really is education? And the second one is there going to be also a new normal for education because of all these new tools or not? So what is education?
Well, let's see, if I had to make up a definition off the top of my head, I'd say education is the process of helping people become better at doing things that are important. So it doesn't mean you tell them how to do it necessarily. It may often be creating situations where they can learn more easily by creating the right kinds of practices or material and so forth. I think it's clear that technology can make a huge difference in education. My PhD thesis almost 40 years ago, I think, if I'm doing the arithmetic right, was about how to use the same things that make computer games fun to make educational software more interesting and enjoyable. So I thought even then that there was huge potential for that. I think the succeeding years have demonstrated that there are a lot of good things you can do with computer games and educational games. I think there are also a lot of other examples of things like Khan Academy, where very good educators put their material online in a way that is easily accessible and often free by people all over the world. It's also possible, though it's taken longer than many people would have thought, for artificial intelligence to become more helpful in shaping the learning opportunities for students. I think we'll see more of that in the future, though it hasn't happened as quickly as I and other people thought it would. But I think the most obvious example, and perhaps related to the question you just asked, is that I think there's a huge potential for education to be done much more remotely than it is done today. I think if it did nothing else, the pandemic should have awakened us to those possibilities. And I think that educational institutions at all levels, universities and below, should be thinking very hard about how they can take advantage of these new possibilities.
Do you believe that from 100% time in the classroom, which used to be the model up until very recently, due to this learning curve that we are going through, we are moving very quickly into, I don't know, 50%? So are you expecting good universities and good schools in general to be using remote technology even after the pandemic is over?
I am expecting that, yes. It won't be all good universities and all good schools, but I think many will, and I think those who do will have a significant advantage. I think that it's even possible, I'll say something a little bit radical perhaps here. I think in our increasingly knowledge-based economy, I think education is becoming more important than ever. So I think that means it's very important for it to be done well, and well includes in an economically efficient way. I think some of the leading universities in the world today still do a very good job of educating their students, but they don't necessarily do that in the most efficient way possible. In part because now they're requiring vast amounts of expensive real estate and people to be present in person to partake in that education. I think that if today's leading universities don't figure out how to do this better, companies or other organizations will. And I think there's some risk for the leading educational institutions, including my own, that if they don't figure this out right, they probably won't go away, but they may become much less central and important in our economy. I think in the case of MIT, MIT has been a pioneer in trying these things out ever since OpenCourseWare, edX, and a bunch of things MIT has experimented with. So I'm hopeful that MIT will be able to apply its innovative skills to this problem as well. But I think in general, even for some of the best universities in the world, there's a chance they won't figure it out and will suffer in the long run for that.
Tom, I really would like to thank you. It has been a great opportunity to get into your mind, and you have certainly taken us to really broad issues, all the way from artificial intelligence to sustainability, climate change, even governments and meetings with presidents, and how to really think in a free way, in an open mind approach on what are the real possibilities. And in all the cases, engineering is down in the center of that, because it has a lot to do with the possibilities we are being able to develop. So let me close this by really thanking you for this opportunity and for having accepted our nomination to you as Honorary Fellow of the Argentinian Engineering Center. It is for us a real honor that you have accepted, and that now we include you in our network, but more importantly in this very particular category for us. And in order to close this, I'd like to give the word to you and and ask you to close this session, if you can and if you want, with some comments on what is engineering for you, and how significant you believe engineering is and maybe in the future.
So that's a great way to close. And let me again thank you for the great honor that you have bestowed upon me, and the honor of our conversation today, which I found fascinating. I guess I'll also say that I consider myself to some degree an engineer. I had an undergraduate degree in that was related to computer science, which you could consider a kind of engineering, I think. And I have a master's degree in something called engineering economic systems from the School of Engineering at Stanford. So even though I'm not only an engineer, and I think at least I'm somewhat an engineer and would like to consider myself that. So it's a special honor because of that in part. I think if one way of thinking about engineering is to emphasize the notion of design. Engineering, in a sense, is about designing good solutions to important problems. Now, often we think about engineering as something that involves physical objects, you know, designing a car or a computer or an electric motor or whatever. But I think you can think of engineering in a broader sense as a process of design, even if the things being designed aren't all physical. And so in that sense, I think everything we've talked about today is a kind of engineering. Not only do engineers design the information technologies that we focused on, but the designing of the companies, the designing of the governments, the designing of the societies. Those are all examples of design. And in fact, to try to emphasize that in our recent work, we've been developing something we call the Supermind design methodology. So it's a way of using concepts like those I was talking about earlier about hierarchies and democracies and markets. It's a way of using those communities, those concepts, to help design superminds, groups of people and often computers doing things that seem intelligent. But in a sense, we're trying to do that from the perspective of an engineer, not the perspective of a politician or you know, a psychotherapist necessarily, but from the perspective of an engineer. How, if you were thinking about it from a kind of engineering point of view, how would you think about configuring organizations and even whole societies in ways that solved important problems? I think that's the last word I'd like to leave with our audience today, that as engineers, I hope you can use your disciplined and creative ability to think about design to also help solve problems that can only be solved with humans, not just with physical objects.
Thank you very much, Tom. Real pleasure. We are closing this session, and it's been a real honor to include you at our institution. Thank you.
Thank you.